Welcome to Treeline. So glad you guys are here. My name is David, one of the guys on staff here. And if you got a Bible, pull it out. We're kind of going through the book of Matthew. So on the handout, right, it says like the gospel according to Matthew. Each week, basically what we do here is we just open up the Bible and we're just teaching through the story of Jesus' life according to like the first kind of book in the New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew. And we're in Matthew 6 today. We're kind of continuing through this section in the Sermon on the Mount. And so while you guys are finding that, let me just tell you a story this week. So last week I came up here a little bit under the weather, and some of you were like, yeah, you still sound a little bit like that. Fair enough. Okay, but I'm better. I'm mostly better. But we've had sick kids kind of the whole last week, and one of the nights, I don't remember if it was night or day, kids have been up a lot, okay? So I'm kind of like, things are mixed up. I don't know if this was during the day or at night, but anyway, all of a sudden, Steffi's upstairs, and she yells down at me. She's like, David, like, and I'm like, what? And it's like, it's never good, right? It's never like, hey, something amazing has happened that's really good, and you get the credit. It's like, something bad is happening. Were you responsible, right? And so anyway, she's like yelling downstairs. I'm like, what's going on? She's like, did you give Silas medicine? And I'm like, I don't think so. Like, I don't think I did that. And so she's like, get up here. And so run upstairs. And, you know, the kids have been sick. And so Silas has this bottle of medicine, right? And it's like the little kid, like stuffy nose, sore throat, headache stuff. But it's like, it's so childproof, right? It's like a childproof cap, but also like you undo the cap and then there's like a syringe that you like pull it out, right? It's like baby stuff, right? Silas has somehow gotten this and has figured out how to like unscrew it and like use the syringe and is just like pounding this stuff. So anyway, it's wild. He's fine. He's absolutely fine. Steffi got him like right in time. But it's just so funny because I was like, oh my gosh, like how in the world have you gone from like, you can't open doors to like, I know how to use syringes in this like really, I'm like, what in the world? But anyway, that's Silas. And, medicine is interesting, right? Because if you look on the back, the reason is like, oh my gosh, like you shouldn't have little kids taking medicine is because there's like a specific way you need to use this. And if you use it incorrectly, it cannot heal you, it can hurt you, right? It's like, hey, take this much and it'll make you better. Take this much and it won't make you better at all, right? Like the opposite of that. And I think what Jesus is doing in this section is it's like he's like peeling back the side of the Christian life and he's giving you like the warning label, right? He's like, hey, I want to explain to you how you can actually live this Christian life in a way that will like help heal you and bring you flourishing. But I want to kind of show you a warning, something to be wary of if you use some of these Christian habits and practices in the wrong way. All right, so we're going to pick this up in Matthew 6. And this is what Jesus says. He says this. He says, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them. For then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Now when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly, I say to you, they have already received their reward. But you, when you fast, you anoint your head, you wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Okay? Now we kind of like took the beginning of 6 and we kind of skipped a little bit and went down to the end. We're kind of skipping this middle section where he kind of breaks out into the Lord's Prayer. We're actually teaching that next week. But I just want to pull out and just say like, man, there's this thing he's talking about, right? You get at the beginning of 6 and verse 1. He just says this, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them. And he gives you the reason. He says, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. So he starts with a warning, and the thing he's warning us about is hypocrisy, right? And he literally says it. He says, you must not be like the hypocrites, which is like an amazing label to just give an entire group of people. It's like, first, you know these people, you know what they're like, and he just calls them the hypocrites. And if you're here, and maybe you're not like, you don't go to church very often, this is like a new thing for you, and maybe your perspective of religion or even like Christian churches is you'd be like, man, the church is filled with hypocrites. Jesus would be like, you're right. Like, that's true. And you just need to know this. Like, Jesus knows that, the thing you see, and he's not on their team, right? Jesus isn't like, yeah, those are my people. He's like, no, that's actually a really big problem. I'm trying to deal with it. And when we think about someone who's a hypocrite, right? We think like maybe the baseline definition is like someone who says one thing and then does another. And that's like a pretty good definition, right? But hypocrite actually comes from the Greek, and it's like this idea for someone who would perform in Greek plays, they were like a hypocrite. It was like they're a performer. It's someone who like takes on an identity, performs it for the eyes of a crowd, and receives praise from them. And so what Jesus is saying, he's like, you need to make sure you're not like these performers. And so he says, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them. So the issue isn't just like, hey, like when you come to church, don't sing or don't ever raise your hand. It's not like saying, hey, everything about your spiritual life needs to be in secret. It's not what he's saying. He's saying you need to be aware of doing that in order to be seen by other people, right? Even just a couple of verses earlier, it says, let your light shine before men. So actually the Christian life isn't just something that's supposed to be in secret. It's actually supposed to be something that's also visible. So the thing he's talking about isn't necessarily the circumstances of our righteousness, but he's talking about a posture of heart that's more concerned about what the world's eyes see than what God's eyes see. And he says, if you live this way and you practice your righteousness for the eyes of other people, that will be your reward. But you won't get a reward from your Father who is in heaven. And he gives us kind of some examples, all right? Look at verse 2. He says, okay, for instance, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you give to the needy, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. It's like, not even like so other people don't know. You should, even yourself, like don't make a big deal about it to yourself. Like if your right hand gives, don't let your left hand know about that, right? So that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. So each of these sections are interesting, right? He talks about giving, but each one starts with an assumption. And so Jesus' assumption here is that if you are his follower, you will be a generous giver. Right? That's his assumption. He's just like, when you give to the needy, he's like, this is, of course, going to be something that marks the lives of Christians. And it's really interesting because I think our idea of generosity has been shaped a lot by the culture of America around us, right? My guess is like, even if you're someone who takes a tiny, tiny bit of what you make and you maybe give it to the church or someone that is less fortunate than you are, there's this idea of like, that's a mark of generosity. But it's interesting, if you actually go through the Old Testament and you kind of calculate out like all the different customs and rhythms that they had, the rhythms of God's people was that they actually gave away about 25% of everything they made. So like a quarter. And that's not like taxes. That's like a total separate thing, right? What Rome took. There was like tithe that you'd give to the temple, and there were all these like festivals too. Like it wasn't just God was like, hey, I want you to just give your money to the church. It was like, no, I want you actually sometimes a year to have like a massive party in my honor where you just go big and you're like, you have steak, you go, like you just go for it, right? And that's like one of these areas of generosity is these huge parties. But one of the areas of giving was to the poor. And this is what he says. It's really amazing. He says, when you give to the poor, don't sound a trumpet before you like the hypocrites do, which is an amazing image, okay? Like, can we be honest about that? This is an incredible thing to picture. So just picture that. Someone in long robes walking down the street, maybe in Ann Arbor, and walks past someone sitting on the ground, little sign, little cup of change, and then they pull out of their garment, not money, but a horn, right? A horn. They pick this thing up and then they blow it. It's like, right? And everybody looks at this person, and then as all the eyes of attention are on this person, then they pull out some money and give it. They bestow it on this poor person, right? And Jesus is just like, what in the world, right? And that's a wild scene. Like, one, who has a horn with them? Clearly you brought that just so you could do this. And I mean, and this is like a weird scene, but in this room, honestly, it'd be something like this. It's like in the middle of worship or whatever, someone stands up and it's like, hey, stop. And like the band stops. And we're like, what's going on? And you're like, I just increased my tithe by 2%. I just want everyone to know that. Like, I needed you to know that, right? And it's a really, really weird scene that Jesus is painting, but this is funny. Jesus is talking about a real thing. This is like real. This is historical. This actually happened. And the idea wasn't literally you'd come and you'd blow a horn so that everyone would watch you give money. The idea was if you were someone who was generous, you'd go out into the world and you'd actually go to areas of the town and you would blow a horn so that anyone who had needs would hear it and they would know, I can come here and this person will help take care of me, right? So it's not just something that like on its face is this like really kind of arrogant thing. It's like it was actually meant to be this useful thing. But Jesus is essentially like, yeah, you know the horn thing people do? Like, we know why you're blowing that, right? It's not for them. It's actually for you. And then he talks about prayer, and he says a similar thing. He says, when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and the street corners. And the reason they love those places to pray is because they will be seen by others. And truly, I say to you, they've received their reward. But you, when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who is in secret, who sees in secret, will reward you. Now, the next 2 weeks, we're going to kind of expand on these things because he comes back and he expands on prayer and he expands on giving and generosity. But he kind of ends by talking about fasting. And this is interesting because Jesus has the same assumption here, right? He just says, and when you fast. So it's like giving. I think everyone would be like, yeah, giving, like, yeah, if you're a Christian, generosity, we get that. Or prayer, right? It's like, yeah, prayer, totally. And then right in that same line of like obvious things, part of the Christian life, he says, and when you fast. It's really interesting. It's an assumption that for followers of Jesus, fasting would be at least somewhat of a regular rhythm of our lives. And so once again, you have this problem where you want to take this kind of quiet, secret heart posture before God, and they want to take it and put it on display. And I want to just stop for a minute and just talk about fasting. We're not going to spend like a whole week on it like the other two, but I just want to start like, what is fasting, right? Because I think of all the ones that are here, this is probably the one that's like culturally most distant from us. We're like, we get giving some money to either the church or whatever, like we get that. We get even like the idea of praying, but fasting, what is it? Because most of us in the room, we don't have a regular practice of it. Well, one, it's not like a hunger strike, right? Fasting is this thing where you intentionally are saying no to food for like a spiritual purpose, but it's not a hunger strike, right? It's not like we're saying like, hey, God, I'm praying right now, but I'm going to like double down and I'm not going to eat at the same time. And you like the hunger strike, eventually God will give you what you want, if you just stay hungry long enough. Well, that's not what it is. But even in a less dramatic way, fasting isn't like a way of sacrificing something in your life to earn favor with God either. That's also not what it is. And the reason is because if we know the rest of the story of the Bible, the thing we learn is that you can't actually earn any more favor from God than you've already been given, right? If you're a Christian, like God's your dad. That's the word it uses here, like your Father in heaven, right? And so you can't get like him more on your side than that. You've been joined to the heir of heaven, Jesus Christ. There's no higher place of priority or privilege that you could have. So there's literally no more favor to be earned or given at all. And so what is fasting? Well, fasting is this intentional denial of something that we are hungry for in order to orient ourselves around a deeper hunger that we have, and specifically a hunger that only God can satisfy. So fasting is. And more than almost anything else in our life, I think fasting is one of these habits of God's people that forces us to ask the question, what am I really hungry for? And I think of all the disciplines in the spiritual life, fasting like forces us to ask that question because unlike most of the other disciplines, fasting is relentless. Okay, I'm gonna explain why. If you read your Bible in the morning, let's say you're like, man, I read my Bible 20 minutes every day. There's this way that you can kind of take that discipline and you put it in one corner of your day and one corner of your schedule, right? And you're like, I do it for 20 minutes and then I get on with the rest of my day. But man, if you fast today, everything about your day is different, right? Like you're not just hungry for 20 minutes, you're hungry the whole day. It's like it goes with you. It doesn't stay in one corner of your schedule. It's like consistently causing us and forcing us to ask ourselves over and over again, do I really hunger for God? Do I miss him? Do I long for him? Or have I begun to be content with his gifts apart from his presence? And this is why I think fasting is one of the hardest disciplines to incorporate in our lives. Because it's like the one that wants to take over everything. It's not content to stay in a corner. It wants to be center stage. And what's interesting is Jesus assumes his disciples will do this. He's like, yeah, when you fast, right? So one question we need to ask, and this isn't like the main point of the sermon, it's just like a sidebar, but like, do we fast? Like this kind of life of denying some things that we are hungry for in order to focus on a deeper hunger we have, do we do that? Or are we a generation of Christians that are just simply hungry for other things? It's something to think about. But his whole point, even with this, even with fasting, even with a culture that was like about fasting, his point is like there's actually a way to fast, a way to stop eating food where the only thing that was happening was you were declaring that the thing you're hungry for more than anything is the praise and admiration of other people. And Jesus is saying, man, if you do that, like if that's what your fasting ends up being about, then you got what you were hungry for. You got your reward of the eyes and praise of other people. And so this is his advice. He says, when you fast, don't look gloomy like the hypocrites, right? Like don't talk about how hungry you are all the time, right? Like don't do that. And don't even look sad. Actually, here's what you should do. They disfigured their faces. Like we don't even know exactly what this was. They probably just made it look worse. Like they kind of made themselves look more anemic than they even were. Like people went on long fasts at this time. And he's saying they've received the reward, but here's what you should do. Anoint your head, wash your face, like take a shower, put on some makeup, like look good. Don't look like you haven't eaten in a long time. Look normal. And the reason you do that is so that your fasting may actually not be seen by others, but it would only be seen by one person, your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret, he will reward you. Now, here's Jesus' point in all of this. I think what he's saying is hey, there's actually a way to pursue righteousness and even a way to kind of take on some of the habits of Christians that rewards you whether or not God exists or sees or not, right? He's like, you can actually give your money and you can pray and you can even fast in a way that gives you something whether God exists at all or not. And his invitation is saying, what I want you to do as my followers, I want you to tailor your spiritual habits towards the God who exists, the God who sees, and away from the potential rewards of the watching world. And this makes sense, right? Because it's like, if you're somebody who's like in your connection group and you're like, I like praying in my connection group. And then when you're by yourself in your closet, you're like, I don't like praying here. It's like there's at least something we should look at and be like, why is that? Like, what is going on there? And I think what Jesus is saying is he's like, I actually want you to learn to develop these postures and these habits and these rhythms in this secret, quiet place that no one else knows about, because in that place, there's only one eyes that can matter, because there's only one set of eyes that are actually on you. And if you can have these kind of habits develop here, they'll be real. And they won't potentially be polluted with anything else. And so we just need to ask the question, like, how are we doing here? Because it's like a warning label, right? He's like, hey, be careful. Be careful. What's your life like in this area? Does our public display of our Christian life match what you do when no one else sees? Like, is the kind of public persona, the public kind of perception of who you are as like someone in this church, does that match who you really are when no one else is watching, when you're in kind of the quiet place just with God? Another way of asking this is like, is there an area of your life where you have kind of started to become a hypocrite? And remember, not just like someone who says something and does another, but like somebody who's like performing an identity. It's like you've stopped tending to your heart before the eyes of your Father, But instead of that, because that's actually kind of a difficult thing to do. It's a costly thing to do, to like tend to your heart before the eyes of your Father. That's like difficult. And so what you started to do instead was you started to just perform the habits of a transformed person in front of the eyes of the world. And this invitation, right? The invitation of Christianity is pretty simple at the beginning, right? It is. It's like, hey, here's Jesus. It's God's Son. He wants to trade places with you. He wants to like take your sin upon his shoulders, pay for it on the cross so he can give you a relationship with his dad. And you can live in like the freedom of that new relationship. And so this invitation from the very beginning of Christianity is to live our lives as children before the eyes of their Father. That's what it is. And so we want to live in a way that makes him proud. We want to live in a way, we want to be like him. But slowly over time, what happens is the rhythms of a relationship with God, they start to become something that we perform for those around us. And all of a sudden, like the eyes of God, our Father, that initially were like, that's why I'm here. Like, that's why I'm at church. That's why I go small. That's why I open my Bible. That's why I pray. Like, everything was about his eyes because there's this new relationship. All of a sudden, it starts to be replaced with the eyes of the world once again. And if I'm honest, this is like my story. Like, this is my story again and again and again. I remember sophomore year, I'd been a follower of Jesus for like about a year and a half. And I started to realize, God started to just poke at my heart and say, hey, do you notice that your private life with me is really different than your public life with me? And it wasn't like I was like stepping up and like trying to like blowing a hole. Look at me, how great I am. It wasn't like that. He was just like, I just want you to notice you are a certain way in a crowd of people or in your connection group. You feel a different way even than when you're by yourself in your dorm room. He's like, I just want you to notice that. And I started to notice things. I started to notice that when other people were praying in a group, I was actually thinking not about what they were praying. I was like actually shrinking back and thinking like, I wonder what I will say next. And it wasn't just I was thinking about what I want to say next. I was like, I wonder if I can say something that will be eloquent and people might think, oh, wow, this is a really spiritual person. And it wasn't just that area. There was tons of areas in my life that were like this. And this was 10 years ago. And I would say I was exactly the person that Jesus is talking about here to beware of. Don't be like them. Somebody who's a hypocrite. My sophomore year of college, Jesus was like, hey, that is you. That's you. And it was the thing that was like hard about that was it was like Jesus was he was pointing at some like rhythms and habits of my life that were born initially out of this authentic faith and love for Jesus, but they'd slowly started to be twisted and distorted. I cared way more about the people around me thought than what God thought. And I realized like everything had to change. Like my whole Christian life had to be like deconstructed, cut down, and rebuilt in authenticity. And so I tried to do that. Like I pulled back from every visible area of leadership. I just like kept my head down and I tried really hard to figure out like, how do I really love Jesus and the people who are around me? And you know what? A lot changed in my life. Like a ton changed. Like I became a radically different person. Like anybody who knows me, you'll know like there's still some like pretty self-righteous, like self-centered things going on, but I am nothing like what I was. Like I'm telling you, it was intolerable. And I started to care less about what people thought about me. And I started to actually care more about what God thought, and I started to actually think about myself less. I started to enjoy my life more, and life didn't seem to be something I had to try to win, but it just began to become something that I could enjoy. And that was 10 years ago. And I've never been the same. But 4 years ago, Jesus started to do the same kind of thing again. At this point in my life, I'm leading Salt Company. I'm directing this college ministry, and once again, God begins to kind of like press in and open me up. And, you know, it was like a big ministry, exciting stuff was happening, you know, and we were seeing God do some amazing things, but towards the end of my time there, God kind of poked at my heart, and he showed me that so much of what I thought I was doing for God was really just something I was doing for myself. And I'll be honest, it was horrible. It was horrible to be in the position of someone who stood on a stage and was talking about the man on the cross while simultaneously like dancing around and trying to get everyone to look at me and affirm how great I am. And Jesus humbled me a lot in that season, and I really would say, like, I'm not who I used to be. But if I'm honest, I feel like once again, Jesus is like beginning to open me up and show me what's on the inside of my heart. And it's like he's putting a magnifying glass on areas of sin in my life, and he's like once again inviting me to change. And here's the thing, there's a part of me that really doesn't want to. Like there's part of me that really doesn't want to change again, because to change again is to admit that there's still parts of my heart that are radically not in sync with who I'm supposed to be with Jesus. Like they're just wrong, like not just a little bit, they're like radically wrong, and they're hard to admit to. They're hard to admit to myself, and they're hard to admit to the people around me. And here's the tension of all of this. Because at some point in your life, and honestly, maybe this text is like for you, and that point is like today, God will lovingly point out to you that you carry within yourself some of this heart of hypocrisy. This thing where you care more about the eyes of other people than the eyes of God, and you are actually way more, your whole life, your spiritual life is way more about performing for other people than it is about having a truly pure heart before God. And he will draw out of you the truth. And he'll show it to you, that your heart's not as pure as you thought it was. And it's certainly not as pure as the people around you might think it is. And you're going to have a choice, right? And the choice is this: do you live for the eyes of those around you, or do you live for the eyes of God? Because that's the difference in this passage, right? It's like, which audience are you living for? And he's saying you can't actually have both. Because these hypocrites that Jesus is talking about, I don't think they were always these people. Like, I don't think this is how their story started, right? I think at some point God put his finger on something inside of them that was like this. And, you know, he's like, hey, there's this thing in you that's not okay. It needs to change. And because they cared more about the eyes of the world than the eyes of God, what they did is they ignored their heart. And they continued to just build this external religious resume. And eventually, this actually became the entire thing their life was about. Everything about their religion was all about performance, about how well they thought they were doing, and specifically how well the people around them thought they were doing. And eventually, this is so fascinating, God became totally irrelevant to their spiritual life. God didn't matter anymore. It didn't matter if he was real. It didn't matter if he existed, because everything about their spiritual life had nothing to do with God. It had to do purely with the eyes of people around them. And so when that happened, they rarely spent time in prayer alone. They rarely prayed in secret, because what would the point of that be? That wasn't why they prayed. They didn't give quietly or to something or someone that would never know or be able to thank them for them, because what would the point of that be? And they certainly wouldn't fast in secret. They wanted everybody to know, because the eyes that they were living for were the eyes of the world. God's eyes were a total distant thing now. Here's a question. Has the honest pursuit of God's presence and his gaze over your life started to be replaced with a desire to be seen as a certain kind of person? Here's another way to ask it. Do you try to give an impression of your spiritual life to the people around you that is a better picture than what happens in the quiet spaces of your life? And this is what's so interesting about this is Christians can be people of tremendous insecurity. Do you feel that? I'm up here, I feel it all the time. There's this thing in us that can be marked by so much insecurity. And sometimes Christians can have this question, right? When you walk into church or you open up your Bible, you're in a group of other Christians, there can be this question am I doing enough? Am I good enough? Am I who I'm supposed to be? And it's this imposter syndrome, right? It's when you walk into church, maybe you feel that this morning, you're if anyone knew who I really was, oh my gosh, I would never be able to be back here. And so you have this thing where there's a certain type of person you feel like you're supposed to be, and you're not that person. And so what you end up doing is you try to perform that person for yourself and for the world. And you're not that person, you're not, but you try to perform it. And live out that as much as you can. If maybe I can convince others, I might be able to convince myself. But as you start to do this, as you stop tending to your actual heart and you start performing this identity, what begins to happen is eventually that's all you have. That's all you have is your performance. And instead of being honest about your real spiritual condition, instead of actually tending to your heart before your Father who sees you, you just eventually become an expert at performing something that gets the eyes of the world. Now, here's the thing with hypocrisy. There's a few ways to deal with it. One is the way that the hypocrites dealt with it, right? You just refuse to admit it, right? You ignore it. It's like God knocks on that thing in your heart and you just say, I'm going to ignore that deep place in my life. And I'm going to just get better at performing the outward actions. And the church is filled with those people. It always has been, and it probably always will be. And most of the people in this room won't know that's you, but you do. And maybe even more than you do, God does. So one, you can just refuse to admit it. You ignore it. You pretend like that's not you. But two, the other thing you can do, if you find you have this hypocrisy in you, is you can just walk away from all of those habits and all of those practices. And you even walk away from God himself because you look at your life and you recognize that something's broken about this, something's inauthentic and wrong. And so maybe everything about my spirituality is fake. And so you just go and you find another audience somewhere else to perform for that has nothing to do with spirituality or religion at all. And a lot of you, that's your story, right? You grew up and you felt inauthentic and you're like, I'm just going to go find something I can do that doesn't make me feel this way. But the third thing you can do is you can actually bring your hypocrisy to Jesus. You can bring your hypocrisy to Jesus. You can leave the street corner. You can stop pretending to be more holy and righteous than you are, and you can go into your room and you can actually rest in the warmth and presence of a God that you can't impress. You can't impress him because you did nothing to earn his love in the first place, but also you can rest in the warmth and presence of a Father whose heart you can't lose because he's committed himself to you forever. It didn't start with anything you did, so you can't get him to abandon you either. And man, some of you in the room, your issue isn't this. You're not a religious hypocrite. You're in the room and you're like, man, I'm not pretending to be a Christian at all. I'm not. I don't know any of this stuff. I don't believe in it. And, that's great. I'm so glad you're here. One of the greatest honors of my life is to preach Jesus and open up the Bible with people who don't claim to follow him. It's an honor for me to open up the Bible to you. But I think that even for you, Jesus is trying to warn you about something. It's he's opening up the warning label of the human experience and he's saying, hey, I want to warn you because maybe the audience you're trying to impress isn't the religious community, but my guess is that every single person in the room, there's some group of people, there's some person you're trying to find affirmation and approval from. And maybe it's on a street corner where you're lifting your hands in prayer, but you're still enacting some story, right? Trying to become some kind of person you think might get the praise of the people around you. And it doesn't really matter, right, what audience you're trying to impress. It doesn't matter if it's a religious audience or it's a secular audience. It doesn't matter if it's a group of pastors in Ann Arbor or if it's a group of professors at University of Michigan. It doesn't really matter what group you're trying to impress. He's saying if you live for the eyes of the world, and even if you get those eyes to praise you, that's your reward. He's saying that's it. That's the sum total of the reward of your life. That fleeting hit of serotonin when someone clicks on your post and says, I like this. Or that kind of fleeting hit of serotonin when everyone comes around you and kind of praises you for your work in front of your peers. Jesus says that moment, that's your reward. That's it. You got it. There's nothing more for you. But this passage says the most amazing thing. It says that there's actually something in life that's deeper than that, and it's more rewarding than that. And it says that the place we get this is with our Father in heaven who sees us. Who sees us. And he's inviting us to live our lives before his eyes so that you can receive his reward. Some of you who are in this room, man, you can just be honest. There's something broken with your experience of Christianity, right? It's not as restful as it should be. It's not as joyful as it should be. It's certainly not as peaceful as it should be. Maybe some of the reason for that is we are actually acting out the habits of Christian life, trying to perform them from the people around us instead of actually just living in the quiet, secret space of our Father in heaven. And that's his invitation. He's like, hey, get off the street corner. Stop that. That's exhausting. Stop. Like, even if you get that, that's all you're going to have. I'm inviting you into this quiet, secret place with your dad. Shut your door, get away from the eyes of the world, and let yourself be seen by your Father. His words are so intentional, right? He doesn't just say, hey, there's a God who exists out there, live for his eyes. He says, no, I want you to be seen by the eyes of your Father in heaven. I don't think we ever escape the need to be seen. Right? It's interesting, even if like people who are like early, like psychologists for like babies, like that's one of the things they will say is they will like, from the very first moment you are born, you are like looking around the world, and the thing our eyes are most attuned to is eye contact from our parents. It's like we'll look away from anything else just to focus on that. Like we want attention. We want to be attended to. And it's like we're born into this world as people who are like looking around the world for the eyes of our Father. But because he's in secret, because he's in heaven, the thing we do is we find some other set of eyes to attend to and attach ourselves to. And what Jesus does on the cross is Jesus on the cross, he trades places with you, and he once again takes his Father and gives him to you, and he gives you his eyesight and his gaze and his attention and his love. And he's like, I want you to live your life here. Not out there, here. Because this is a place of safety, right? You don't give your money away so that you can kind of feel good about yourself. It's like, no, your Father in heaven is saying, no, I love you. Like, we're good. Like, I love you exactly as you are. And so you give out of this place of not trying to become the right kind of person, but you give because you're like, I want my heart to value the things God values, and so I'm going to try to give to the things that he says he cares about. And prayer isn't this place where you try to like become a certain person or show everyone how you're so spiritual, but like you go into this quiet place with your dad, and he's like, I just want to talk to you. I just want to spend time with you. I want to have a relationship with you. You don't have to earn that. You don't have to try to find that. If you pray 5 times a day or 1 time a day, like that's not gaining you anything. Like, I'm your dad. You're my kid. And when you fast, right, like when you like deny things of this world and try to like cultivate this like deeper hunger for the things of God, like that's not impressing him. But when you do that in the quiet space with God as your Father, he looks at that and he's like, I want to actually reward that. Like, I love that. I love that thing you're doing. It's not for the eyes of the world. It's for me. It's in this quiet space. And I think there's like this really beautiful place of safety in the secrecy of life with our Father, that no matter who you are in this room, he's inviting you into that. Like some of you, you've never experienced that. Your whole life has lived for the eyes of the world, and you're exhausted and you're restless, and maybe that's why you're here this morning. But some of you, you've been a Christian for a long time, and you're still restless, and the reason is because your life is one of performance, and you're trying so hard to be the right kind of person, and Jesus is just like, hey, just come with me. Get away in the quiet. Get away from those eyes. Look at mine. Look at my eyes. I want to give us a chance to do that this morning.